Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom, and we're talking all about the archaic Greeks, right? So we left off in class talking about the archaic Greeks, right? And the way that we are outlining how we're talking about the archaic Greeks, and I know I told this to my B period and my C period, and we got a bunch of stuff done, and we reviewed a ton of stuff about the Mycenaeans and the Bronze Age collapse and the Dark Ages and the everything that came before this, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we're starting off with those similarities, right? What are things that even city-states like Athens and Sparta, who were so different from each other, still did the same because they were intrinsically considered Greek by culture, right? Now, here's the weirdest part about it in the long run, is that these people don't even really consider themselves Greek. Really? Like Spartans called themselves Spartans and Athenians called themselves Athenians, but they all spoke the same language and did similar things. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is we know that they had cultural diffusion because of all these trade items, right? They were learning to coin money from the Persians. They were all competing in the Olympics, right? And we talked about this in class, how they were all competing in the nude, right? Like that, literally the earliest Olympics, they all had to compete in the nude and naked and stuff like that. And some of the biggest events were like javelin and discus and wrestling and boxing and racing was the very first event. And we also talked about the phonetic alphabet, right? That's a phonetic alphabet based on sound. They learned this from the Phoenician people, and this, of course, being their Greek phonetic alphabet right there, right? So, like, now, the big thing, though, that we did talk about as well is, like, we explained what a phonetic alphabet is, and we talked about that. We talked about the Phoenicians being the purple people in my C period class. I remember that. Now, the Olympics, though, we left off with in C period. We're talking about the prize, right? Like, what did you get when you won? And Brianna was, like, actually, like, not Brianna, Brianna in my class, brown hair Brianna, it was very, very curious about, like, oh, well, what did you get? Did you, like, and then I think Molly was like, oh, so did they give you, like, a wife or something? Like, no. The prize for actually winning the Olympics was considered two things. One, pride, right? Pride for your city-state and demonstrating that you were the best in this athletic competition and you were from Sparta or you were from Athens or you were from Corinth or you were from Thebes or you were from here, there, wherever, and you brought pride to your city-state, right? The other big thing you got was an olive wreath that was shaped in the way of a crown, right? Literally looked a lot like this laurel wreath that I have right here. It's a little bit different. It's a Roman version or whatever, but they gave you one of these bad boys to wear on your head and demonstrated how awesome you were and stuff like that, right? And also, in the long run, that immortality perspective, your name was recorded so you would live on forever as being one of the best in the biz at that particular thing, right? Now, another big thing that the Greeks shared in common with each other was forms of art that they created, right? And the main two forms of art they created were known as black and red figure pottery, right? This is alluding to the color that the people, places, things, or imagery is on the actual pot, right? So as you can see right here, this is black figure pottery, and this is red figure pottery, right? Both are pretty much all Greek city-states did this similarly, and they used this artwork to record history, record myths, or actually like jot things down, and actually basically just have an enduring perspective that went on through the ages, right? Now, black figure pottery came first because it was the easiest of the two to create because you're literally just painting black, like actual paint onto a like orange terracotta pot. Red figure pottery, on the other hand, is very difficult because you have to do everything in reverse, right? Because it's the clay shining through the pot in the glaze, because that color right there, that orange color, is the natural color of the clay the pot is made out of, right? And so red figure pottery is much difficult, and so as time progressed, red figure pottery did become more popular because it showed the artisan's degree of expertise, right? So black and red figure pottery, make sure you write those two things down. Black and red figure pottery, right? You're going to need to know those things, okay? Make sure you got them, all right? Sculpture was another big thing, but we won't talk about that right now. So getting into it, though, architecture is another big thing that most Greeks shared in common with each other, right? Now, when we're talking about architecture in the Greek era in general, you could make a lot of arguments for a lot of different things. You could talk about the stones that were used. You could talk about marble and granite. You could talk about pediments. Pediments are like the little triangular-shaped roof up here, right? The one that's on like the actual White House and the Lincoln Memorial and basically any government building on the planet, because literally democracy and the concepts we use come from ancient Greeks, particularly sort of kind of ancient Athens, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. But the main thing that sticks out to you on this architecture is the columns, right? And so there are three types of Greek columns that you're going to need to know for your test. But let's jump over to my whiteboard real quick and let's check them out. All right, I'm sitting over here in Kate's seat or Madeline's seat or whoever else sits over here too. It's crazy. I know two Madelines in a row sit here. I know Kate sits here, and then I think in my F period, I can't remember who sits here in F period, but we'll figure it out. Now, the big thing about it is there are three types of Greek columns, right? Three specific types of Greek columns that you're going to need to know for the test. And you're going to need to draw these in your notes underneath where you actually have columns written, right? Some of you are probably thinking to yourself, why do I have to draw them? Why can't you just show me a picture? No. I'm so angry and angsty. I'm in high school, right? Well, look, we want you to draw them so you can actually take the effort and actually imprint it on your memory. And so when you're studying, this is about actually matching up things with an image, right? So I need you to be able to see them, okay? So the big thing about it, though, is our first column is known as a Doric column, right? The Doric columns are just very, very simple. They had like a rounded kind of top, and they had the column going underneath, and they had a flat top, and they just held the roof up, right? That right there is a Doric column, right? Of course, alluding to the Dorians, right? The same people that started the actual Greek Dark Ages and stuff like that. Simple in their design, just like the Dorians with the Dark Ages could read, could write. Now, we're not saying that these are bad or dumb. We're just saying Doric columns refers to the Dorians, right? Now, we could go further than just these three. We could do Minoan columns over here. We could do Tuscan columns over here. But we're mainly focusing on the three types of archaic columns that actually kind of really popped up. So this is the Doric column. The next one are ones that look like this, right? Which are really intrinsically used in Greek design, right? They got the little swirly-dirlies up at the top. And there's actually a very famous movie that I love so much, Hercules. And in Hercules, the Disney movie, he has ionic swirls all over his stuff and almost all over every single thing in that entire movie, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that is an ionic column, right? An ionic column looks like this, and they have these kind of little pediments on top with these little swirls on either side. That is going to show an advancement in intelligence, right? And this is going to be more difficult to make, which is going to show us as history progresses, the Greeks are going to keep getting smarter and smarter, right? The last one are these ones that had kind of like a triangular or trapezoid-like top to them, but on the inside, it looked like ferns everywhere, right? It literally looked like things were growing out of them, and it looked like there were branches going off the sides. And these right here are the most famous out of all the columns and the fanciest out of all the columns. These are called Corinthian columns, right? That is the Corinthian order of columns. Again, demonstrating a leap forward in intelligence, right? And you can see these on so many different buildings in ancient Greece. You can see them on any ancient, you can even see them in the modern era. I bet one of y'all walking around your house has one of these columns floating around your house. And when you get home, you should just go up to your parents and be like, that is the Doric column. And they're going to be like, how did you know that? And you're going to be like, Mr. Terry told me. And so, it's going to be a very, very big learning moment for you. But make sure you have those drawn in there. Make sure you know those. We'll review those in class, okay? Now, let's pop back over to my desk and let's keep talking about the Archaic Greeks. So those columns are crazy important. Make sure you highlight that stuff. It's a fill-in-the-blank question on your test. You're definitely going to need to know. I just told you it was one of the questions on your test. I probably shouldn't have done that. But now the big thing about it is, though, hey, whatever. It's recorded forever, right? Now, the next thing that all the ancient Greeks did, the Archaic Greeks did, that was very similar to each other, was the creation of a certain type of city structure, right? And basically, in a nutshell, every single archaic Greek settlement was known as a polis, right? And so the polis became basically the epicenter for all government activity and for all, commercial activity as well for ancient archaic Greeks, right? Particularly the Athenians and the Spartans, right? I need something in my hand. So the big thing about it, though, is the polis is the design of their city-state. This right here is the remains of the ancient polis of Athens, and this right here, of course, is the polis reconstructed. This is what we believe that the polis would have looked like when it was actually fully made and stuff like that in ancient Athens. And so looking at it, though, you'll see or realize that there are two parts to the ancient polis, right? The polis is referring to the city itself and all the surrounding areas that were used for farming and for people to live on, right? So the two parts of the ancient Greek city-state polis are, one, the Acropolis, which is the higher elevated city, because acro literally means high or elevated, and it means the high city, which contains religious temples and areas for religious ceremonies, right? That's why the Parthenon is the highest mounted building on the Acropolis of Athens, right? We can actually see that right over here, right? Notice these things right here. That is the Parthenon when fully constructed right there on top. The Acropolis was very important. It's where most actual communal activities happen together. It's where women were actually finally allowed to leave their house, but we'll get into that when we get into Athens here in a little bit. The Acropolis was a major part of the city, and it's that higher elevated city with all the temples to the gods and goddesses, right? And then you had the lower walled city, which its main focal point was the agora, also known as the marketplace, right? So the agora, or the marketplace in Greece, is one of the most important places in the history of Western tradition ever, right? Mainly just due to the fact that this agora is going to be the meeting place where people can come and talk and listen to one another and debate their ideas and buy their wares and sell their wares and make their money. And it's where the focal point of all Greek economics existed. The agora is crazy important. Highlight agora, starry agora, circle the agora, 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 agora. The agora is very important. How important is the agora? I think it's very important. Thank you. Very good. So the big thing about it is I heard you over there. Ava. Yeah, I heard you over there, Ava. The agora is very important, right? Good job, Ava. Now, the big thing about it, though, getting into it as well, is that there are also other parts, right? So people are like, what about all this stuff? All right, so, there are other parts. In Athens, you had your naval base down here, as well as in Sparta, you had the surrounding farmland and homes where most people lived. Only super rich people lived inside the wall in the actual city-state or inside the polis. All the other areas outside of it were used for farming and for actual, living space. This right here, though, those are the ruins of the actual ancient agora in Athens, right? The leftover areas, and it would be basically a series of stalls, right? So basically, in a nutshell, the agora is like the lakeside mall, right? It's like stores built into these different areas where you can go up and buy and shop and get what you need to get, right? So the agora, very important. Now, all ancient Greeks also practiced a very similar religion. So first and foremost, they were polytheistic, right? So polytheistic, what that word means, it means that they worshipped multiple gods, right? That they had several different gods and goddesses, attached to different forces in nature or attached to different ideas or concepts or things in society and stuff like that. So make sure that you know that, okay? Now, speaking of, and you know this already, because again, referencing back to that Disney movie I just talked about, Hercules and stuff like that. Zeus is the god of thunder and the king of gods. Hera is his wife. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. All these, that, the other, all these different gods and goddesses had a role, and they believed, ancient Greeks anyway, archaic Greeks, believed in many gods that lived on an actual real mountain in northern Greece called Mount Olympus, right? Mount Olympus is a very real place, right? Mount Olympus is actually a super, super, super tall mountain in ancient Greece, or in Greece. It was to them considered the highest peak at the time. And the really big reason why they believed the gods lived there was because human beings at the time couldn't get up there, right? The air is too thin, it's not very easy to traverse, it's usually covered in snow and things like that. So they, of course, in their mind are like, oh, the gods who are basically superhumans and stuff like that live atop of this mountain and dictate and judge the rest of our lives from a very great height, right? So now getting into it though, and also the only reason that the ancient Greeks actually believe in the gods that they believed in is mostly due to one dude, right? This one guy named Hesiod, right? So Hesiod is going to write a very famous book called the Theogony. And the Theogony is a series of poems that describes all the different gods and goddesses. And this is Hesiod right there, right? So Hesiod in his text, coupled with Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, are going to demonstrate the foundations of early Greek religion. It was in the Theogony that Hesiod brought up many of the earliest myths. It's where he brought up many of the earliest gods and things like that. So you need to make sure you know Hesiod. Hesiod, highlight him, he's very important. And his book, The Theogony, is going to create and set up the system of gods and goddesses the archaic Greeks used. Now, archaic Greeks also used similar warfare methods. Now, this will become particularly important when we're talking about one specific place when we're talking about warfare methods.
This is Sparta!
We'll get there. Now, the big thing about it, though, is warfare methods were very similar. First of all archaic Greeks used iron weapons and armor, which is very important that we understand, right? Iron weapons and armor were all used by the archaic Greeks to subdue their enemies or keep out invaders or marauders or the like, right? So, big thing, though, also, is the name of their soldiers. They all were called hoplites, right? All ancient Greek soldiers were called hoplites. This is what a hoplite looked like in full gear. This is actually a black figure pottery piece of hoplites fighting one another, right? Now, you'll notice that they carry iron weapons and armor, right? Usually wearing an iron skirt and then also wearing an iron shirt, a plated shirt, and a shield. And the main weapon of choice was a iron-tipped spear, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is what hoplite means. And it's also really, really important that you don't get the word hoplite confused with a later H word that we're going to talk about later on in this flip, okay? So the big thing getting into it, though, hoplite basically means shield in ancient Greek, right? Shield. It refers to their shield or each individual person as their equipment or the things that they have on. Reason being is because of how the hoplites would be used to fight, okay? Now, hoplite military warfare wasn't necessarily the same all the time. Early on in the Archaic period, hoplites would kind of just square off with one another in large groups and stuff like that. But over time, what ended up being created in ancient Greece, particularly perfected by Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, was this system right here. And it's called a phalanx, right? Say it with me real quick. Phalanx, okay? Say it one more time. phalanx, okay? The phalanx system is going to be the system that the hoplites would actually set themselves up in rows and rows and rows and rows and rows with their shields up front and their spears over the top, right? Trying to make it borderline an impenetrable force, whereas that way, whenever they fought anyone, that they couldn't break their lines and things like that. It's going to become particularly handy when we get into a set of wars a little bit on. The phalanx. Make sure you know the phalanx, right? The phalanx is very, very important. It's this big, giant armored turtle thing that all these hoplites were made up of, right? So getting into it as well, the last thing that all archaic Greeks did that you need to understand very, very well is colonization, right? So archaic Greeks in total all tried to colonize different areas, especially Athens, right? Now, what a colony is as their city-states progressed and got bigger, they would send some of their citizens out to create a new city-state a little bit further away to try and find resources to send back to the mother state, right? So basically, if I am Athens, I would send out a group of people to go colonize an area, make a small village and stuff like that, begin mining sources or precious metals or farming or something like that, and I would have it all sent back to Athens in a simple form of colonization, right? And so as you can see right here, the Athenians colonized a lot of stuff, right? So now it's not just the Athenians here. All this orange right here, the darker orange, is areas of which Greeks created colonies on, right? And as you can tell, Greek colonization is very, very important, right? Now getting into it though, we're now moving into our analysis of two very key city-states, right? We need to make sure that we know who these people are, because now we're looking at the differences, right? So we just looked at the similarities, the phalanx, the hoplite, Hesiod and the theogony, the religion, the Olympics, the art, the trade items, the money, and everything else that they all did similar to one another. But now we're looking at how the two city-states of Athens and Sparta are drastically different from one another. And we're going to start off with Athens. We're going to start off with the ones who are the intellectuals and the creators of democracy. Sort of, right? So now Athens was located about right there, right? They were actually very, very focused on trade and later on a navy as well. As you can see, they have a lot of natural harbors that go around them very, very close. And we've heard about this thing right here, Peloponnese. That is actually the area where the Mycenaeans originally settled and stuff like that. So the Athenians were a little bit northeast of them, right? So Athens, being a little bit further up in ancient Greece, is very important that you understand that they are intrinsically very different from the rest of the Greeks around them, right? So first of all, let's talk about their patron goddess, right? They are named after Athena, right? The patron goddess of, swift peace, justice, proper war, and then also intelligence, right? And so a big thing about Athena is her ideals were heavily carried forward by the Athenians when they were creating all of their things that we still use in the modern era, with the biggest one being democracy, right? So democracy comes from a Greek word, which is demokratia, which literally means the popular government, or by the people, right? Which again, is sort of how they use it in Athens. We'll get into the hypocrisy here in a minute, or how Athenians were basically giant hypocrites in general, but we'll get to that here in a sec, okay? Now, we believe that they were settled originally during the Dark Ages by a group of people known as the Ionians, right? Now, more than likely, they were settled by the Dorians. We're not going to get into that right now, but the Athenians didn't want to consider themselves settled by the Dorians, who were responsible for basically the Bronze Age collapse and stuff like that, right? So we believe they were settled in the Dark Ages by the Ionians. And as the settlement grew, it became what was known as an aristocracy, right? A lot of this is due to the fact that Athens is replete with really, really good farmland. It has very, very good farmland for growing olives and growing lots of other different items like barley and wheat and many other different things. And so what ends up happening, though, as we know when we talked about the Neolithic Revolution, when anybody gets super, super, super wealthy, there's going to be somebody under them that's very, very, very poor, right? So what's going on in Athens is there was a class of elites or nobles that began to grow, right? And leave behind everybody else. And so you ended up with a society of very, very rich people in early Athens and very, very poor people, okay? And this is going to kind of create a foundation for new governments going forward, right? Because the Athenians hated this concept, right? The poor people down here don't like aristocracies because they don't like being told by this rich person who doesn't necessarily know their lives what to do, right? So as this aristocracy began to grow, things began to get really bad, right? And so really bad in the sense that the aristocrats and the wealthy began to exert their power over the poor, right? And so in ancient Athens, why are we talking about this? Some of you are probably like, Mr. Terry, why are we talking about what they did early on? Talk about what they did early on so you can understand why they did what they did when they created their democratic systems, right? Things got really, really bad, though, as time went on, Because eventually, when poor people would need certain things, right? When they would need certain things from the aristocrats, when they would need tools or supplies or seeds or, help during bad harvest times or what have you, right? The aristocrats would charge them for it, right? And make them pay a certain amount of money. And what ends up happening is some of these people at the bottom don't have that money, right? And so they end up going into debt to the aristocrats, right? And this right here is what's known as a horos, right? The horos stone in ancient Athens became a symbol for what this thing is known as debt slavery, right? So in ancient Athens, early Athens, when these poor people would have to borrow money and stuff like that from the Athenian aristocracy, what would happen is the Athenian aristocracy would put a stone outside of their hut that said who they were, the boundary of their land, and all the money that they owned or that they owed to the aristocrats, right? That's super screwed up because basically, in a nutshell, that person couldn't leave until that debt was paid off, and they had to do everything the aristocrat told them. So they were creating slaves, but it was slavery using debt, right? And so the aristocrats began fighting for power with one another and trying to become what's known as tyrants, okay? So a lot of these aristocrats, whenever they were together, you would think like, oh, you guys are going to get along because you're all jerks together, right? Well, no, they're actually going to end up arguing with each other, and they're going to end up leading to a really big rift between the factions, right? And a couple of them are going to rise up and be created as what is known as tyrants. A tyrant is a leader elected during a time of crisis that has complete control. And tyrants typically are very mean and very bad leaders, right? Now, big thing about it going forward, though, is then came the biggest advent that the Athenians have given Western society. The rise of voting, right? So what ends up going down is as tyrants were beginning to take control, the aristocrats kept getting together and trying to figure out how are we going to pick our leaders? How are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure certain people owe us certain amounts of money? How are we going to make sure that we're actually being led effectively? And it came to the rise of voting. And the very first thing about voting you need to understand is voting is the essence of democracy, right? That's why it's demokratia, or the popular vote, right? And the earliest form of voting in ancient Athens was literally when they would have these big citizen assemblies and they would ask people to raise their hand, right? That was the earliest thing of voting in ancient Athens. Is like basically, all right, everybody raise their hand. And then they would just count, right? Which was a very difficult way of doing things, but it led to a system where they started electing better leaders, right? With this hand raising and stuff like that originally, only super wealthy people were allowed to vote. This picture is a little bit inaccurate because we have some poorer people right here up front, okay? But the big thing about it is only crazy wealthy people were allowed to vote, and originally it was done with literally raising your hand, right? So getting into it, though, then comes in this figure named Solon, right? Solon is going to be insanely important to the progression of ancient Athens, okay? Solon, the great government reformer, rises up through the murk, and he gets elected to the position of Archon in Athens, right? So after the tyrants kept seizing control, and after a lot of people were getting fed up with these concepts, and as people were in super bad debt, and they had these stones out front of their house that said how much money they owned to somebody, which is so screwed up, and they were slaves at the time, Solon is elected Archon, and he comes in, and he starts creating sweeping reforms. He is considered the father of modern-day government, right? He comes in, and he creates a series of really big reforms that leads Athens to more equality for men. Now, we'll get into that here in a second. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is that these reforms are going to do a lot of different things. They're going to standardize money. It's going to outlaw debt slavery, right? Literally, it canceled all debt, period, which is crazy, right? Solon came in and was like, you know what? Debt's a bad thing. Cancel it. And he just canceled all debt, period, across the entirety of ancient Athens, right? And then he outlawed that concept of the horos and had them all destroyed and said that you will not enslave any other free man because of debts, period. You owe him because he is your worker, right? And so another thing is he extends citizenship and he opens up voting to more people. He made it so any Athenian citizen who was male and freeborn over the age of 20 could vote, right? This is going to be a massive thing that happens, and Solon is going to go down in history as the person that leads, like Athens, towards democracy, right? The rulers that follow Solon are going to expand on his democratic principles, and they're even going to bring in new rules like bad rulers could be kicked out of town with this system. called ostracism, right? So, like, it's a genius concept, right? A couple of people that followed after Solon, like this guy named Cleisthenes, is going to bring in this concept of ostracism, right? So now Solon has come in, outlawed debt slavery, standardized money, canceled all debt, made more citizens and stuff like that. But now what's going to happen is the rulers that are going to follow in his image, the archons that are going to be elected that follow in his image after him, are going to make it so if you're a really bad ruler, the Athenians can get together and decide if you can even live with us anymore, and they could vote to cast you out of town for 10 years, right? And the coolest thing was, as well, is that Athens was then divided into a series of tribes, or like districts, or voting districts, which became very, very important, and it became an element of their bureaucracy. So each tribe would vote for certain things, and then the votes would be tallied all together at once. Made it so voting was more systematic, right? But the issue is that if you're expanding more citizenship, and you're expanding the rights to everybody, and you want to start ostracizing bad leaders, and you want to do all this other crazy stuff in Athens, you're going to have to figure out a better system of voting, because doing this ain't going to do it for you, right? Because it's going to be impossible to count everybody. So what they introduce is systems of voting using ballots, right? They would either have like names written on shards of pottery, like this one right here. These are actual ancient Athenian ballots that we have recovered from ancient Athens in multiple different locations. And you would have a name scratched onto it to let them know who you were voting for. Or if you were voting in something like an ostracism vote, should he stay or should he go, it has two options. People who couldn't read and write voted using black or white pebbles, right? And you would literally go up and grab the one. Let's say white is for kicking, I don't know, like, who am I going to pick on right now? Kicking Cadence out of class, right? Like, so white is kick her out, black is let her stay. You would walk up to the pile and grab up whichever one you felt, and you'd walk over to a pot, and you'd drop it in there. And then they break the pot open, and they count up everything, right? That is how voting was done in ancient Athens. I find that to be so cool. So the big thing about it, though, getting into it as well, is that Athenian women are going to have a very important place and time as well. Athenian women are going to come along, and they're going to keep progressing, unfortunately not forward. So now the biggest thing about it is Athenian women, and I think as a male teacher at an all-girls school, you need to understand women's place in society and just about everything we talk about, right? Athenian women had little to no freedom whatsoever, right? They had also, big thing you need to understand, they could not leave the house without their husband's permission whatsoever, right? They were not allowed to go into the agora. They were forced to marry at the age of 14. To men that were significantly older than them, right? So, and they had no choice in who they married whatsoever. They were used in religious ceremonies. So the only time that they were ever brought out was when they had certain religious ceremonies that would happen on the Acropolis. They had no choice in who they married whatsoever. It was a really rough existence for Athenian women, right? Very, very terrible existence for Athenian women. Now, Athenian education, on the other hand, is another thing that also wasn't offered to Athenian women. Athenian women were not allowed to know how to read or write. They weren't allowed to know how to do many things, right? Only wealthy male children could receive an education in ancient Athens. For all this democracy stuff, sounds to me like you're not letting a lot of people participate in this popular government, right? So only wealthy male children were allowed to actually receive an education. They learned how to read, they learned to write, they learned public speaking, poetry, music, and received basically no military training, right? Which is a very important thing that we understand. Now, speaking of that, though, we got to also understand that this is leading into one of the most important civilizations of people that we will talk about all year. And that is, we are now going to be talking about these guys.
This is Sparta!
That's right, the Spartans, right? Who are so well known for their war-style tactics and warrior-like culture that they even have a Lego man made after them. Look at that Spartan warrior Lego man. I love it. It's Mr. Madrano. All right, so now the big thing about it, though, in general as well, is we're going to be getting into it, is that we have to understand that we are going to be moving through Sparta very, very quickly and then getting into the Persian Wars tomorrow in class, right? But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one. I'll talk to y'all soon.